favorite pharaoh, Sneferu? Well, there were three things I wanted to stress about him. If you remember, one was that he established artistic conventions that would last for 1,000 years. The other was he made Egypt an international power, going off to the Sinai for turquoise, to Lebanon for cedar. But the most important was probably that he showed Egypt how to build the pyramids. He's the one who figured out how to build the first true pyramid. Now, today I want to talk about his kid, his son Khufu, who built the Great Pyramid at Giza. But let me say something about Khufu's name first of all. He's also called Cheops. So when you hear about the Great Pyramid of Cheops, it's the same guy. His mama called him Khufu. That was his Egyptian name. But the Greeks called him Cheops. They corrupted his name.
No. See, well, first of all, let me say thank you for joining the conversation. And second of all, why? And I'm going to keep bringing this up. Why is it every time I hear about a great Egyptian king or prince or leader, I always find out, oh, that wasn't their real name. That was something the Greeks came up with. Why? Between the Greeks and the Arabics, they just wow, destroyed everything. And I say destroyed because if they really appreciated the Egypt, if they really truly appreciated Egypt and all its glory, they wouldn't have been so hell-bent on changing every possible name they could. I mean, I understand, they didn't speak Egyptian well, so they came up with a Greek name for it, or in the case of the Romans, a Roman name for it. But when you look through the history books, you rarely see the true names of these people and these structures. You always see the Greek representation or the Roman representation. I was born a black man, I grew up a black man, and I'm gonna die a black man. I don't want a Greek name. Okay? I don't want to be remembered as a Greek or a Roman. If I could find out what my ancestral black name was, I'd probably use that. But hey, it is what it is. But yeah, Chops, Lamb Chop, Chopstick, whatever his name was, no. His mama named him Khufu, I'm going to call him Khufu. So, with that being said, let's get into it.
So, Cheops and Khufu, it's the same pharaoh. Now, let me start by saying that he didn't just build a pyramid, he did other things too. He also built a huge boat next to his pyramid, and I want to talk about that also. But let's start with the pyramid. Now, let me start by acting like a tour guide. Let me give you some statistics about the Great Pyramid of Giza. Now, Giza, of course, is a suburb of Cairo today. It's a plateau, right? And on it, Khufu, Cheops, decided to build his pyramid. It's the largest pyramid ever built. It's 480 feet high. Until the Eiffel Tower was built, it was the largest building on Earth. Its base is so large that it covers 13.5 acres. It's made of 2.5 million blocks of stone, and they average about 2.5 tons each. An incredible monument. But let me emphasize something right from the beginning. It's not the kind of monument that required higher mathematics. It's not a high-tech monument. It required masses of labor, skills at social organization, getting people together to build it. But it didn't require higher mathematics. Now, there are an awful lot of myths about the pyramid, the Great Pyramid, its magical properties, people who've had strange experiences inside it. Let me say a few words about that right from the beginning. First, we know the purpose of the Great Pyramid of Giza. It was a tomb for the burial of the pharaoh. No question about it. Now, the difference, remember, between a tomb and a temple is a tomb is a place of burial, a temple is a place of worship. This was a tomb. Now, you hear many stories about the magical properties of a pyramid. For example, I'm sure you've heard that you can put a razor blade inside a pyramid shape, and if it's dull, it'll become sharpened. Or that if you put food inside a small pyramid shape, that the food won't decay as quickly if it were outside. All of these stories about the magical properties of the pyramid are silly. Think about what we've learned in the last 2 lectures about how a pyramid developed. The Egyptians would have thought it was silly. There was no magical significance to the pyramid shape for the ancient Egyptians. Let's think about how it developed. Remember prehistoric times we had our sandpit burials. They eventually developed into rock-cut burials. You go into the bedrock so the sand won't blow away and reveal the body. Then at some point somebody had the idea of building a little structure on top of that, a mastaba, a bench-like structure. And then when we get to the 3rd dynasty, Imhotep, the architect of Zasir, had the idea of putting a mastaba on top of a mastaba, and then they enlarged it and put a few more mastabas, giving you this wedding cake effect, the step pyramid at Saqqara. Then comes Sneferu, my man. And he had the idea of filling in the steps and getting the first true pyramid. The point I want to make is the pyramid shape was an architectural development, almost an afterthought, almost an accident of the way tomb building was going. No one sat down and said, "Ooh, this has a magical shape, let's build a pyramid." It developed, it evolved. So this razor sharpening, the magical properties of the pyramid, people sleep under pyramids, it would have even been silly to the ancient Egyptians. Now, with that said, let me go on to some other stories about the pyramid, and then I'm going to show you how it was built. I want to go in detail and give you a step-by-step description of how the Great Pyramid was built. But let me just say one thing about Napoleon inside the Great Pyramid first. You'll remember from a much earlier lecture when I talked about the origins of Egyptology that Napoleon's expedition to Egypt in 1798 was the beginning of Egyptology. And if you'll remember, Bonaparte was a bit of a scholar, a mathematician of sorts, a member of the French Institute in the Division of Mathematics, and he did indeed visit the Great Pyramid when he was in Egypt. Now, he visited it with some of his men, and he did not climb to the top of the Great Pyramid. It's possible to do that. It's illegal, you need special permission, but it's possible. It's like going up a giant staircase. While his men were climbing to the top, Napoleon walked around it, and he made a mental calculation. He was good at math, there's no doubt about it. And the calculation that he did was, he tried to figure out, given all the stones, he came to the conclusion you could build a wall around the world, that kind of calculation. He loved to do that. But the interesting story is he went inside the Great Pyramid. He went inside. Now, he went in with an entourage, several people, and went to the burial chamber. And I'll be talking about the burial chamber later. And eventually he asked if he could be left alone inside the burial chamber. They left him alone. And then he came out, and he looked kind of white when he came out, ashen. And one of his officers said, "Are you okay? What happened?" And Bonaparte said, and this is the story that's been repeated down the ages, said, "Never mind, you wouldn't believe me," and left. And he never spoke about it. When he was on St. Helena, he was exiled to St. Helena, he was talking to one of his men, and the man said he was about to tell me about it, but he said no, and never did it. So we really don't know what happened with Napoleon inside the Great Pyramid. Maybe he had some mystical vision, and maybe nothing happened, and he just wanted to kind of create part of his legend. But there are plenty of legends associated with the Great Pyramid that just aren't true. Let me start with what Herodotus tells us about it, our Greek tourist who went to Egypt around 450 BC and saw everything and wrote down everything. Now, if you remember one thing he said about the Great Pyramid, which we're certain wasn't true, that inscribed on the outside of the Great Pyramid or the onions and bread, the amount of food that was needed to feed the workmen. That's certainly not true. Nobody's going to put that on his pyramid. But what Herodotus does tell us about the building of the pyramid, and this is interesting. He says, now he was told this, of course, and remember, he's there in 450 BC. Pyramids are almost 2,000 years old. He was told that it took 90,000 men working on the pyramid at the same time to build it, right? And it's 90,000 men working. They worked 3 months at a time, it seems. Now, what I think is this. Did they work in shifts, a few months at a time? What happened? Well, the 90,000 men is an interesting figure. And the 3 months at a time, I think, is interesting. What probably happened, and this is a theory that I think may be the good theory, the pyramids, of course, were built with free labor. No slaves. The Exodus, when we have all the Israelites in Egypt, is much later. There were never a large number of slaves in Egypt that were used for work projects. Never.
You don't know how bad I want to rewind that part and let you hear it one more again. A lot of people believe that the Bible has been tampered with. There are also a lot of people who say there's nothing wrong with the Bible. It's all about perspective. Somebody misquoted, misunderstood the Bible, and just ran with it. Okay. But if the Bible says there were slaves in Egypt at a certain time, and then you find out through history that there were slaves in Egypt, but not at the time that the Bible says, then who's right and who's wrong? Because as far as I can tell, as far as I know, the people who wrote the Bible after these events took place. Peter, Paul, Matthew, most of them didn't write their own story. Their story was written after they died. Man. So the pyramids were built, but not with slaves. People under duress tend to make a lot of mistakes because they really don't want to be there. They don't want to do the work. These are people who wanted to do the work. They weren't slaves. So if the Bible is saying that there was the slaves built the pyramids, these archaeologists are saying that that's not true. There were slaves in Egypt, but not at that time. So then the question becomes, why did the writers of the Bible assume that the slaves built the pyramids? Or maybe it wasn't them. And the reason why I say that is because even with the King James Bible, for instance, you're talking about a translation of an ancient language. Okay? If you don't translate, I'm not a linguistic, but common sense would say if you're trying to translate a language that's not your own, if you don't translate it just right, you're going to miss something. You're going to mess something up. And then you put it in writing, and you got people believing this when it's not true. A lot of ancient languages didn't have vowels. The Bible was written the King James Bible was written in the 1600s, I believe, 1600s, by a European. And he didn't even translate it himself. He paid other people to translate it. So then the question becomes, how good was their linguistics that they missed something? I think they did. I really do think they did when they translated it, because remember, you had the ancient Egyptians, then you had the the Arabs, Arabics, then you had Greeks, and you had Romans. So you had all these different time periods where people conquered Egypt, and they used their own language. They translated the Egyptian language into Greek, Arabic. So it's possible. I'm not saying it's absolutely true. Like I said, I'm not a specialist, but common sense, just using common sense, it's possible. It's very possible that it was something was translated wrong. And I truly believe that. That's my opinion, and that's what I'm sticking to. Because Grandma used to tell me, she don't believe in consequence. She don't believe in coincidence. Something might be a mistake the first time, and it's kind of funny that it happened a second time, but a third time, that's not a coincidence. You keep hearing the same thing over and over again, there's some truth to it. Even if it's a lie, that lie is based on something that was true and it got blown out of proportion. So, in saying that, just listen to what the man is saying. He's spitting out some true knowledge, and I agree with a lot of what he says, because before I started listening to these lectures, I've heard things from other outlets, other people on YouTube, books, PBS specials, History Channel specials. So I get the feeling that a lot of what he says is true. The pyramids were not built by slaves. So whoever started that rumor, whoever thinks that, when the Bible was talking about slaves, that the slaves built the pyramids, they're wrong. That's all there is to it. They're just wrong.
Okay. You ever watch those movies where you see the pyramids being built, and you got the slaves hauling on the blocks, and you got one guy with a whip whipping the slaves, pulling the block? Didn't you ever wonder why the slaves don't just grab this guy and beat him up? There was no weapon in ancient Egypt that gave anybody a great advantage over a large number of people. It would be very difficult to control thousands of slaves. We know for a fact that the Great Pyramid of Egypt was built by free labor. We have inscriptions by the work gangs that worked on the pyramid, which says, Khufu's gang did great work, things like that. So it was built by free labor, and Herodotus says 90,000 men worked on it a few months at a time. Now, what I think he means is this. Egypt was mainly agrarian. Practically everybody was a farmer. Now remember that the Nile overflowed its banks each year. And one of the seasons in Egypt was called inundation, when the land was inundated with the water. What that meant was there was time when the fields were underwater. You couldn't do anything. Then you had a large workforce that you could marshal to work on the pyramid. So I think during inundation, you had maybe 90,000 men working on it at one time. You got the farmers, unskilled labor, everybody pulling together to build this pyramid. That's probably what Herodotus means. He says something also that's very interesting about the pyramid. He says it was built with machines. Now, of course, this is 450 BC. What does he mean by a machine? One possibility is levers. Levers. The Egyptians, to this day, have a device called a shaduf. A shaduf, they use it for raising water from the Nile to the fields. What it is, it's a long pole, and at one end, it's got a weight. At the other end is the bucket. So the bucket goes down, and then the weight pulls the bucket up with the water in it, and you dump it into the field. And this you can do, you can lift things rather easily. It's a kind of lever and fulcrum system. That's what the Egyptians may have had. What some people have suggested is that they had these levers, these shadufs, so to speak, on each level of the pyramid as they're lifting blocks up, up, and up. And that's what Herodotus may have meant when he said they had machines. But he gives us one of the very few ancient accounts of building anything. For some reason, the ancient Egyptians never wrote down how they built a pyramid. We have no papyrus at all that gives us a clue to how they built the pyramid. Now, I don't mean it's only pyramids that they didn't write down. We have no architectural papyri at all. Think about all the buildings that the Egyptians did, and they never wrote down how to build a temple, how to build a pyramid. Never. It may have been a kind of secret among the architects that they didn't want trade secrets to go out. There were other things they didn't write down. For example, they mummified people for thousands of years, but there's no papyrus that tells us how to mummify a person. So these are trade secrets. So if we're going to figure out how the pyramid was built, we have to sort of just look at it and think. And that's what we'll do. Now, first, when you go on the Giza Plateau, there are two pyramids that are actually look very similar. It's hard to tell which is the Great Pyramid. One was built by Khufu. That's the one we call the Great Pyramid. That's the tallest one. But there's another pyramid that's only 20 feet shorter, built by a successor, Khephren, as he's called by the Greeks. And the way you can tell them apart is the one that is not the Great Pyramid still has some of its white limestone casing at the very top. At the very top, it's got a little bit of frosting at the top at the peak. That's how you can tell that that's not the Great Pyramid. Most of that fine white limestone casing was pulled down in the Middle Ages to build the mosques of Cairo. So if you want to see the really fine white limestone casing of the Great Pyramid, go to the mosques of Cairo. It's called Tura limestone. It came from the Tura quarries. Now, how do you build a pyramid? Okay. First, as you know from last lecture, you don't build a pyramid on sand. Sand is unstable. It shifts. It moves. You clear down to bedrock. And then what you have to do is level the bedrock. You want it perfectly level. Now, how do you level an area 13.5 acres?
Good question. How do you level an area 13.5 acres? I guess we'll have to get into that at a later date. But, yeah, just a brief recap. What have we learned today? The ancient Egyptians built the pyramids. They did not use slave labor. There were no devices, weapons of any sort that would allow the Egyptian rulers to enslave that many people at one time to build the pyramids. So you're talking about technology. Weapon technology was not to the point where, you know, they had whips and other devices where they could instill fear into slaves. There were no slaves. These people that built these pyramids, they wanted to build the pyramids. A lot of them were probably bored because they couldn't do any farming. So yeah, there's a lot of misconceptions about ancient Egyptian civilization, about the Bible, and he kind of bridges the gap between the certain passages in the Bible and natural history. And I think that's important because you have a lot of people who wholeheartedly believe in every word the Bible says. But again, like I said, the King James Bible, as well as other Bibles, is a translation. So we have to think about how fluent were the people that were translating the Bible. Because in the 1700s, a lot of Africans were slaves in America. So of course, in order for the European nobility to come up, they had to translate it out of African languages, out of Egyptian language, into their own language, so they could know how to use that information so they can live better lives, so they can provide for their family. I know a lot of people might not want to hear what I have to say on this subject. That's why I use the audio book. So you don't have to just take my word for it, Yeah, I chime in, I give you my personal thought, but at the same time, this guy is accredited professor of Egyptian history. So I don't know how else to tell you. But thanks again for listening, and I'll talk to you later.